It's been far too long since my last devlog, not to mention since the last playtest build of Galactic Chef, and I'm still quite a ways from releasing the next build. Stating the obvious, I'm terrible at predicting how long things will take. The thing is, I've made games before, and then I spent 7 years as a software engineer. I figured going back to games, it would be easier this time. But the reality is, I've never made a commercially successful game before, so I need this to be a better game than I've ever made before, which of course is going to be beyond my experience. And so I've made mistakes. I've scrapped and redesigned systems many times that if I were more experienced, I might have gotten right on the first try. But I take some solace in watching postmortems of highly regarded games and realizing that I'm not alone. It's not uncommon for game design to change mid-development, nor are long delays uncommon. And even relatively small indie games made by a team of people often take more than a year to create. So really I shouldn't have expected this game to take less than a year if it's going to be any good. So really I don't regret the time spent or the scope creep. My only regret is that by talking about specific timelines and release dates that I haven't met, I'm disappointing some people. Especially people that are still waiting on cargo defense. So in the future I need to rethink how I communicate things so I can still show behind the scenes but not get people's hopes up too early. But now, with that out of the way, I've got some big updates to talk about. Underpinning a lot of these changes is a new approach to content generation. Rather than having one random number generation seed for everything, there's now a universe seed and a season seed. But more importantly, in the home universe, where you have your first playthrough, everything is now handcrafted. This gives me greater control over the Earth ingredients, but also making a polished first-time experience. Each parallel universe gets a set of ingredients and judge preferences that will remain consistent within that universe. So you can play different seasons of the same contest with different challenges, different selections of rotating guest judges and ingredients, but still everything that you know about those ingredients and judges will remain consistent. And if you do want to start from scratch, you can just go to another universe. So as you might imagine, I've completely redesigned the ingredient editor. Now it's focused on crafting that first run experience. Everything else is procedurally randomized from the starting point with certain constraints so that it's not 100% random, but it still allows for drastic changes in every attribute. I won't go into much detail here because everything is subject to change, but for instance, retiming the cooking thresholds is done strategically to make sure that it's still possible to get a perfect cook. Which brings me to the next big change. The entire reaction system for how a particle changes when you apply heat or water or anything else has also been redesigned. The main purpose being to add a bonus for getting something cooked perfectly, as well as reintroduce a penalty for overcooking. So in a sense you can break this down into 4 phases. First there's a minimum cook time for how long it takes to clear the raw hazard. Then there's a window of time leading up to what I'm calling the perfect point, but that's a little bit misleading because not every ingredient's bonus is based on just getting within a margin of error to that point. It's a little bit more complicated for some ingredients. But this is also a turning point for how the food changes over time. Past this perfect point, it uses a different set of changes to the flavor, color, and texture. This is also where any sizzling sounds or steam particle effects will stop. So for some ingredients, that's your clue to take them off the heat. The next phase represents overcooking, although there's still a small margin of error before you actually get a penalty for it. And then in the final phase, you'll start to see smoke as the food starts burning. Although none of this necessarily applies to every ingredient, I can turn these behaviors on and off. So for example, things that melt might not steam or burn. I should also clarify, while I was talking about a minimum cook time, all of this is actually based on energy, or the integral of a heat rate over time. I just designed the editor around time to make it easier to think about. And yes, I do plan on releasing this editor for creating custom ingredients someday, but probably after the initial release of the full game. One critical aspect of the cooking simulation is that in addition to running it in real time for the dishes you're actively cooking, I can also simulate arbitrary time intervals in the background, both for generating NPC dishes and for the recipe planner generating previews. I've now converged these two cases into one system based on a recipe class. Regardless of how it's generated, Recipe can simulate its steps to produce a dish abstraction, which is basically a wrapper for a liquid group and a food core. Everything you need to represent a dish for scoring without actually creating any nodes. Speaking of which, the scoring and judging system has been completely redesigned too. Criteria can now be collected from 3 sources: the challenge itself, the judges, and ingredient bonuses, plus some universal criteria that always apply. Rather than always scanning for every possible criterion, I now configure a scan pack to select which information should be gathered, then pass it to the dish abstraction to fill in all the information from its liquid and solid particles. When it's done, the scan pack holds all the information needed to score the criteria. The criteria themselves are represented by a list of criterion packages. These allow for sort of templating. The criterion model determines what type of criterion it is, like a required ingredient, portion size, flavor balance, being served hot, etc. And some of these models require custom data to indicate which ingredient, texture, flavor, etc. they apply to. I can also randomize that custom data for procedural challenges or alternate universes. The actual scoring process is now done in a static method inside Criterion package, just so I can keep all the model's specific logic in one place. I've shifted my thinking recently to trying to come up with every possible behavior and criterion, etc., so that as I'm rebuilding these systems, I can accommodate all of these possibilities and make sure that hopefully I don't have to rebuild them again. I'm thinking through cases like, what if the sandwich criterion gets randomly picked but there's no bread in the ingredients list? Well, now the universe generates an ingredient from every template up front. Even if the contest isn't planning to use it, it's easy enough for an individual challenge to override the ingredient list and pull in something with the bread tag if needed. There have been a lot of smaller changes, but probably the biggest gameplay change is replacing the pipette with the squeeze bottle. It gives you more control over how much liquid you're moving, and hopefully it's a bit more intuitive, but really the main reason I added this was for the secret sauce in the first challenge, so that now you can scribble your sauce onto the sandwich. And now, the most time-consuming but probably least interesting change is to text scaling. I thought I'd solved this months ago with Godot's font oversampling feature, which in theory makes text look clearer when it's scaled up, but I started seeing problems at some resolutions where edges of text would be cut off, even though the controls didn't have clip content enabled. I tried a lot of things, rebuilding every piece of the UI repeatedly, but in short, nothing gave me the results I wanted. Finally, after complaining about my struggle on Discord, I got a great suggestion from Cheesiness. In short, with Godot's 2D scaling mode, every canvas item gets scaled automatically to fit the window size. But since that scaling isn't doing what I want, I'm now counteracting it by applying an inverse scaling, and then adjusting the font size instead, so the text is actually rendered at the native resolution. To use this strategy for the full game, I built a mechanism to register every text-containing node with my director class, which now reacts to window resize notifications to rescale and resize all those text-containing nodes and modify all their font resources. But I still needed to rebuild the game's entire UI one more time. After some trial and error and working around another engine bug, finally text looks just right at every resolution, all the way from the low resolution of 960 by 540 up to the native 5K resolution of my iMac. Thanks, Cheesiness. There's still a lot to do even for the next playtest build. Save and load are completely broken, there's unfinished business in almost every system, and I still need to add more content just for the first 3 challenges, which are going to act as a sort of expanded tutorial. And when I think ahead to what's going to be needed for the full game, it's a bit overwhelming. The soundtrack alone will probably take at least a month if I'm going to make a good soundtrack. So, I'm reluctantly going to try crunch mode. Now, to be clear, I don't condone employers pushing crunch mode on workers, asking them to stay late, work weekends, or putting any pressure on them to do so. But as a personal choice, I think the stress of feeling so far behind outweighs the risk of burning myself out by pushing myself harder. So I'm not promising to remain in crunch mode for the rest of development, I'm not making any promises about timeline, but I am going to do my best to finish this as quickly as I can without sacrificing quality. And because I'm focused on that, there probably won't be many videos besides playtest release announcements and trailers between now and the finished game. But after it's finished, I look forward to doing a post-mortem, maybe some tutorials, maybe even a review of the Godot engine. So as always, it really helps me out if you hit the like button, spread the word, and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, thanks for watching.